Today, this next session, we're moving into discussions around infrastructure. So the first presentation in the afternoon is going to be by Jordan Peterson, the Principal and Chief Disruptor of Affinity North, and Scott Smith, a Partner of Environmental and Indigenous Resource Law at Gowlings WLG. And they'll be talking about rooted relations, building sustainable bridges with First Nations in large projects. All right, thank you very much. Let's dive into it.
Jordan Guinsey, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jordan Peterson. I run a consulting firm called Affinity North, and originally from Aklavik, Northwest Territories, and been living in Whitehorse for the last almost 4 years. Scott?
Yeah, good morning, or good afternoon, everybody. My name's Scott Smith. I'm a partner at Gowling WLG. My practice focuses on major projects and Indigenous people's participation in major projects. Do a lot of work in the mining sector, and just an honor and privilege to be here presenting with Jordan today.
Thanks, Scott. So again, our presentation is called Rooted Relations, Building Sustainable Bridges with Yukon First Nations in Major Projects. And to kick us off, projector or here? Okay. And the survey says, the Yukon government, Yukon First Nations, and industry should consider co-developing a collaborative governance model to guide strategic discussions and decision-making processes about the future of Yukon energy generation, transmission, and natural resource projects. And using the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a reconciliation framework to inform the co-development of that collaborative governance model.
So this slide just sets out the outline of what Jordan and I are going to be speaking to you today. And what we're trying to do here is talk about a framework between the Yukon government, Yukon First Nations, and the mining sector that could come together to deal with a number of the issues that you've been hearing about over the last few days, as well as stuff that's been in the paper, including the potential intertie between the Yukon and BC grid system. So when Jordan and I thought about that, thought it might be helpful to advance a thought piece on what a collaborative governance model would look like. And so that's really what we're going to be covering today. So we'll start with some background and context, get into some of the key provisions of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and talk a little bit about how that can be used as a framework for reconciliation moving forward, and really, in our view, inform the development of the collaborative governance model that we'll be talking to you about today. So over to you, Jordan.
Yeah, so a bit more on that background and context. Only about 24% of energy used in the Yukon comes from renewable resources. And in terms of the GHG reduction targets from our Clean Future, we need to reduce Yukon's total GHG emissions from specified sectors by 30% below 2010 emissions by 2030, and which will put the Yukon on a path to net zero by 2050. In terms of the GHG emissions that come from mining, which makes up about 10%, and that's from 2017, again, from our Clean Future Yukon Strategy on Climate Change. And then the Yukon government is also considering this intertie. We've heard it yesterday on a panel from Minister Stryker, and we've been hearing about it in the news the last couple of months, and we really do need to move towards more renewable energy to be able to support critical mineral extraction.
So in putting that the framework together, we also wanted to look at an Indigenous perspective and make sure that that was front and center in terms of the background and context that we're advancing and discussing today. And Jordan was nice enough to show me a absolutely wonderful document entitled Reconnection Vision, Pathway for Change from the Children of Tomorrow, put together by a number of First Nations youth across First Nations in the Yukon. And I was sort of blown away by the depth of the analysis and wanted to share a few quotes with everybody today because I really think it talks about the Indigenous perspective that we need to bring to bear in this collaborative governance model that we're considering. And we've broken it down into energy, mining, economy, and governance. So energy, we will understand that everything is connected through energy. Our physical bodies are held by our energetic essence that is intertwined with the energy of life, elements, and spirit around us. These relationships will determine how we build our electricity and energy systems of the future. And you've heard a lot about that over the course of the last few days, and we're of course going to be speaking about that. Of course, this is a mining conference, so we didn't want to exclude mining. And one of the quotes was, quote, "Our grandchildren will have a relationship with everything they need, and our current models of extraction will be transformed. Mining policies will be reformed to support the local economy and reflect reciprocity." Economy, we envision an economy that holds care for our community at its center. This economy will be guided by our virtues as Yukon First Nations people and will be based on the principles of share, care, and respect. It will prioritize love, purpose, and belonging. And finally, governance, and this is probably one of the more directly applicable quotes in that wonderful report, and we're going to come back to it and infuse it into the governance framework that we're talking to you about today. So the quote was, "We will honor our Indigenous laws. Indigenous law and leadership will transform Crown government systems we currently work within." So that's the work that we're talking about doing today. Indigenous law revitalization will be resourced and supported to enable joint legislation that honors the spirit of true, equitable collaboration and partnership in governance and decision-making.
So, using the United Nations Declaration as a framework for reconciliation. Again, coming back to UNDRIPA and DRIPA, Canada enacted the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act last year. And amongst other things, it provides that the declaration is a framework for reconciliation and sets out how we are to move forward together. And it's also used as an international human rights instrument. The province of BC has also enacted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and as well, the GWT just enacted UNDRIP legislation last month as well. And the purposes of DRIPA for BC is to really affirm the application of the Declaration of the Laws of BC and to contribute to the implementation of the Declaration and really to support the affirmation of and develop the way that we develop these relationships with Indigenous peoples.
And of course, there's an important role for industry, including the mining sector, to play in implementing the declaration. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Call to Action 92, focuses on the role of businesses in reconciliation. I'm not going to read all of the words on the slide here, but I'd commend that people review it. But the key concepts are that we're going to use the declaration as a reconciliation framework. And so it sets out 3 sub-bullet points, including obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. So in the remaining part of the presentation, we're going to show you some of the articles from the declaration, and then hopefully we've done a pretty good job of integrating the core concepts in those articles into the collaborative governance framework that we're going to present to you today.
So some key articles, and I'm going to read them directly from the declaration, are Articles 3 to 5, which affirms the rights to self-determination and pursuit of socioeconomic and cultural development. Article A speaks to the protection of destruction of culture. Sorry, it's been a long week, and I'm sure everyone can agree with that. Articles 11 to 13 speaks to the rights to cultural revitalization, practice of customs, access to cultural sites, ability to transmit culture to future generations. And Articles 18 to 19 speaks to the rights to participate as decision makers in matters impacting Indigenous peoples, so free, prior, and informed consent. Articles 25 to 26 and 29 speaks to the rights to maintain, strengthen spiritual relationships with traditional lands and waters, rights to lands, territories, and resources, and rights to conservation and protection of the environment. So again, coming back to the reconnection vision of the Yukon First Nations youth, all of these articles speak to the importance of not just the revitalization of our culture, but the inherent right to self-determination and self-government, and the rights to cultural revitalization and the protection of our practices and customs.
So in the next few slides, we're going to set out some of the elements of what we think could form the basis for a collaborative governance model that's informed by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and in particular, those articles of the Declaration that we just looked at. So I think we've got about 10 points here, Jordan. First and foremost is implementing the Declaration and using it as a framework for reconciliation requires a paradigm shift. That's going to shift from Crown governments leading things to Yukon First Nations leading strategic energy and natural resource planning and ensuring that Yukon First Nations are involved in all decision-making processes about Yukon's energy future and natural resource development. And we've sort of foreshadowed in previous slides the role of Indigenous legal orders. So this Article 5 of the Declaration speaks to that issue. But really the job that we have in front of us, and I think it's a really interesting and important one, is to go through that process of the reconciliation of laws. So what does it mean to stand up Indigenous laws and Indigenous legal orders with the current Crown legal system, and to change the Crown legal system and how decisions are being made to ensure compliance with the Declaration and that Yukon First Nations are involved in all critical decision-making processes in relation to energy and natural resource development. So, maybe you want to, one more thing. So the purpose, so why would we want to go about developing a collaborative governance model? And it's really to provide a framework for strategic discussions and new decision-making processes between the Yukon government and Yukon First Nations to address Yukon's energy future and natural resource development. And I'm going to emphasize this with a defined role for industry. I'm involved in a number of conversations across the country on how to build these processes. And there are no sort of right answers from my perspective, and I'm sure that the Yukoners in the room would agree with me that you need a made in Yukon solution here, and that there's an important role for governments, Crown governments and Indigenous governments, but also for the resource development and energy sectors to play in these types of discussions and decision-making processes.
And before we move on, I'm just wondering if you can maybe provide a few examples. I know we took them out, but I feel like it's really important to understand, primarily because although we are speaking about Yukon and Yukon First Nations and Yukon government and industry here in the territory, I do think it's really important maybe to underscore some of the projects that are happening in Canada that really relate to the way that this is working, but also equity ownership in projects.
Yeah, so a couple of examples, and thank you for that, Jordan. So one of the processes I'm working on in British Columbia right now is a resource management planning process that's going to initially focus on forestry and then turn its eye to mining. That's a process that's being co-developed by the government of British Columbia and the Kearns-Canny First Nations in the Prince George area. That's been a tripartite process where initially the forest industry and subsequently the mining industry will play a key role in participating in those resource management planning processes. So a couple of examples there. Of course, also in BC, we have the DRIPA, so the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and what are commonly referred to as Section 7 agreements. Those are the consent-based decision-making agreements that are being rolled out across British Columbia. So there's now 2 officially on the books and a third one that everybody's heard of but hasn't seen yet. The 2 are in Tahltan territory and relate to environmental assessments of mines in Tahltan territory. There's a third that involves seashell territory and decisions in relation to docks. But that's increasingly what we're seeing is a tripartite approach where you have Crown governments, Indigenous governments, and industry coming together to collaborate in relation to resource management and planning processes.
Thanks, Scott. And again, wanting to just reemphasize the importance to understand that that this is happening across the country and primarily in BC. And there are conversations right now in the Yukon where this is happening as well. But I think just coming back to the scope of these key elements of this governance model that we're talking about, it can relate to energy, can relate to transmission and natural resource projects that are required to help meet Yukon First Nations energy needs. Those projects could include the interconnection of Yukon and the BC electricity grids, transmission lines in the Yukon. And again, there continues to be a number of different conversations where this is actually being talked about to the extent of ownership of transmission lines and infrastructure in the territory, and really to enable First Nation-led renewable energy generation projects. And again, coming back to natural resources as well and looking at how we can apply this kind of model to new natural resource projects here in the Yukon. And then finally around nature-based solutions. And this will continue to come out. The federal government now is transferring nature-based solutions fund to the National Guardians Network, where First Nations across the country are now leading and choosing the types of projects that are happening. So coming back to ensuring that First Nations play an active role in the types of decision-making that's needed.
So you might think that list of projects is fairly broad and that we might be a little crazy for proposing this, but just to emphasize, these conversations are now happening across Canada. A similar conversation is happening in British Columbia between British Columbia First Nations, the BC government, and BC Hydro in relation to the proposed twinning of a transmission line that goes from Prince George to Terrace. And then there'll be proposed spurs that go north out to Rupert and down to Kitimat. The breadth of those conversations at the request of First Nations has been expanded to include the transmission line, historic issues in relation to the previous transmission line, the recently announced call for power. So first time we've had a call for power in a long time in British Columbia, and to talk about how more generally the twinning of the transmission line could facilitate northern economic development in the province of British Columbia. So emerging examples of success stories in terms of developing and implementing these collaborative governance models. So a couple of other key elements. So we've got 2 slides left here. They're going to require new decision-making structures where Yukon government and Yukon First Nations can come together and make strategic planning and other decisions in relation to energy and natural resource projects, again with an important and defined role for industry. So Jordan, you asked me about equity ownership. So when I was here last year, I talked about the leading trend across the country of First Nation equity ownership in major projects. That trend has only increased in the last 12 months. Seeing equity ownership by First Nations being achieved on transmission lines throughout the country. A number of pipeline deals have been announced in the last 12 months out of Alberta, in BC. That transmission line that I mentioned a moment ago, the North Coast transmission line, there are ongoing discussions for First Nations to achieve equity ownership. What I also talked about last year was the biggest challenge to achieving First Nation equity ownership of major projects. People often refer to that as access to affordable or competitively priced capital. Major challenge that we're seeing. Of course, this week we heard a decision out of the federal government and sort of the update on the budget and the discussion about the development of a federal loan guarantee program for First Nations to help deal with that access to capital issue. That's going to continue to be one of the largest challenges that we all need to work together to overcome. What we've set out here in point 5 are some of the policy approaches that other jurisdictions in Canada have taken to facilitate First Nation equity ownership of major projects. So including direct awards of, there's a lot of acronyms here, EPAs or electricity purchase agreements or power purchase agreements, depends on what jurisdiction you're from, to First Nation owned renewable energy generation projects. I've heard a lot about the aspirations of Yukon First Nations in terms of developing their own renewable energy generation projects, and having direct awards to them could greatly facilitate the development of those projects. Loan guarantees and other financing mechanisms, things like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, other mechanisms required. In a lot of the deals that I've been involved in negotiating, industry has stepped up to the table and brought solutions to bear to deal with the access to affordable capital issue. In C here, we have a concept that came out in Ontario in the Green Energy and Green Economy Act in 2010. And in that process, the Ontario government, through the Ontario Power Authority, agreed to pay what was called an Aboriginal adder. And that was a premium for electricity generated by projects that are majority owned by First Nations. The net result of that and the Aboriginal loan guarantee is we now see a number of First Nations that are the majority owners of wind, solar, and hydroelectric projects that have been advanced over the last 15 years in Ontario. So lots of very large success stories there that we can build on. And then capacity funding to cover pre-development and development costs. These are sometimes barriers to First Nations achieving equity ownership. Next point, and the last point on this side is, and if you achieve First Nation equity ownership early on in project development, it helps align First Nations and proponent business interests, but it also provides a really interesting opportunity to ensure that the project is co-developed in a way that builds in Indigenous values, decision-making, and ensures that the priorities of First Nations are being achieved by the projects in their territories.
And just to also add and encourage industry in the room to start having conversations with the nations you work with about loan guarantees and those kinds of programs, because one of the things that we heard when having these kinds of discussions with the federal government is that they didn't believe that industry would give up equity. So a bunch of nations across the country went and talked with some of the biggest players in the country, and they started lobbying together to show that industry is ready for this kind of movement forward. And then we have another 4 points here around free, prior, and informed consent of impacted First Nations required as a mandatory condition, and that that should be for energy and natural resource projects. Historic redress. I know this is a conversation not just here in the Yukon, but all across the country around projects that were really put into our traditional territories without our consent, without our involvement. And I think that First Nations rights, to redress must be addressed as a basis for moving forward with future energy and natural resource projects here in the Yukon.
So maybe if I can add to this point, I know this one's a controversial one and one that I think a lot of folks have a difficult time addressing. There are some really positive precedents out there where historic redress has been positively addressed in the energy sector, for example. So Ontario Power Generation, which used to be part of Ontario Hydro, went about the business of developing new hydroelectric dams and generation stations in the province of Ontario. And they had as a corporate policy that they needed to address historic redress issues before proposing new projects in First Nations territories. And there's a bunch of agreements that were signed where OPG, in a really industry-leading way, led the charge together with the Ontario government to deal with the issue of historic redress. There's a bunch of innovative ways that this can be addressed for new energy generation and transmission projects. Happy to talk to folks about that after our presentation if you're around. And that this is an issue that isn't just coming up in the Yukon, and as Jordan mentioned, it's coming up across Canada. And part of the fundamental discussions between BC Hydro, the BC government, and BC First Nations on the North Coast Transmission Line project.
And we've continued to hear this week and almost at every Geoscience that I've been to that industry wants certainty around their projects. They want things speeded up, but that can't happen without land use planning here in the Yukon. It needs to happen. And we need to complete those land use plans, to inform the strategic energy and natural resource planning that needs to happen, that First Nations should be leading. And then coming back again to the nature-based solutions that we spoke about in the last slide, that net zero requirements for future energy and natural resource projects will require nature-based solutions.
And I think just if I can add to that point, so we've got tight net zero targets. For a lot of projects, that's going to require carbon offset projects to get to net zero. And these carbon offset projects, if you look at nature-based solutions, can be a really interesting way to achieve our net zero targets in a way that increases the stewardship economy. So stewardship projects, restoration, rehabilitation projects designed by First Nations and executed by First Nations to increase sustainable economic development. Absolutely critical to deal with a lot of the cumulative effects loading that we're seeing both in northern British Columbia and the Yukon, and to help to continue to adapt to the rapid changes that are coming in as a result of global climate change. So these are the types of really interesting conversations that I've had the privilege of being part of and looking at, and I think the advantage of thinking about not just a project in isolation, but how thinking about, from a strategic perspective, energy future, energy projects, both on the generation and the transmission side, mining, how all of these things can come together to solve some of the difficult problems that we're faced with.
Thanks. And we've got 3 minutes for questions, if anyone has any.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. So for those of you that weren't able to hear it, it's what is a nature-based solution, and don't hear a lot of it talk about it in the mining sector. So the way I think about nature-based solutions is they can be stewardship projects or restoration or rehabilitation projects that are designed to deal with impacts of previous resource extraction activities, forestry, et cetera. Pardon me?
Climate change.
Yeah, deal with climate change, all sorts of stuff like that, where, for example, you could be looking at reforestation. You might not just, like in the part of BC I work in a lot, for a long time, monoculture stands of pine plantations have been planted, which don't provide good biodiversity benefits, et cetera. So those could be planted with native species, a diverse ecosystem. That diverse ecosystem can be managed over time, that those plants and trees grow up, they sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to help deal with GHG emissions, and stuff that can be really designed from an Indigenous lens to deal with impacts to Aboriginal title, Aboriginal rights, and treaty rights, and some of the challenges that a number of Indigenous governments are facing across the country in terms of ability to meaningfully exercise those rights on the land base.
Yeah, and it's really important to also understand that most of these kinds of projects, I think, are going to be led by First Nations. We think about Indigenous fire management systems in the past that we have left behind, and we need to start bringing those kinds of systems back into place to ensure that when we're looking at the adaptive cycles of our ecosystems, that we're not interfering, but rather providing solutions back to really mitigate the effects of climate change. One more question, if there is.
Yes, just thinking about timeframes for these things to happen. Obviously, there's a clash a little bit between industry, who have quite rigid timeframes. I understand the Indigenous culture doesn't work so much on fixed timeframes. Can you speak a little bit about how that can be maybe bridged, that gap can be bridged?
Do you think projects are happening quicker without First Nations? They're not, right? And I really want to speak to that because I think where First Nations are involved, I'll use Snowline as an example, right? We have a great partnership between NND Development Corporation and their exploration camp. And the types of partnerships that we're creating are coming back to not just mitigating diesel consumption, but actually putting together partnerships that speak to the values and of not just the nation, but Indigenous people more largely. And I think the question you asked is really what's wrong with the perspective of industry. And I'm trying not to be offensive here. I just think it's like Tosh said yesterday in the panel that I moderated, we've dealt with all the low-hanging fruit already, and that we need to start having the tough conversations to ensure that projects, not every project in the Yukon is going to XCOM.
Yeah, the way I look at that issue, thanks for your question. We're in a challenging environment to deliver on major projects. So we've got net zero requirements. Those are pretty tight. We've got major impacts, cumulative loading to landscapes, and global climate change happening at a rate that nobody predicted, right? And we're trying to say, how can we work together in a way, and the last one is we need to achieve economic reconciliation. So how do we create a fertile environment to deal with all of those challenges in a way that actually provides the basis for getting to yes and for building new major projects in the Yukon and across Canada? And that's really why we're suggesting this collaborative governance framework, because there isn't right now, well, there's an emerging, I think, discussion among Yukon First Nations, but there isn't the sort of formalized process to have these discussions. And the issue, for example, if you got concerns about caribou or fish or moose or other wildlife, if we're not addressing those in other forms, they tend to creep into project-based environmental assessment and create conflict between project proponents and First Nations. And rather than bringing sort of regional solutions to those issues, then they're getting into the territory that you're talking about, which is slowing things down, et cetera. So it's really, we think, in having these conversations, creating the forums, ensuring that Yukon First Nations are participating in a decision-making role and function is going to help quite a bit.
And just to maybe one final thought on that question, that Indigenous knowledge really is the solution to climate change, and to really that fight that we are all in right now.
So TKC is 5-10 years down the road. We're talking the next couple of years. Let's roll. It's our turn, and we're ready to roll.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, the energy conversations that are happening in the territory are, First Nations have been saying this for the last 5 to 10 years, right? And so I completely agree. And is exactly why we're pitching this governance model so that nations can come together with government together as well to start having the conversation about how do we actually get there. So thanks for your time, everyone.